Richard Sherry is a clinical psychologist and a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. He has 10 years experience in the field, and he's recently completed a humanitarian aid trip to Haiti. And in this lecture, Richard will be discussing key learning points between disaster medicine and the treatment of addictions. So I'd like to welcome Richard.
It's okay, yes. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I think if I can start by looking at both the treatment of addictions and disasters, with addictions medicine and disaster medicine, and some of the psychological learning points between really trying to understand these two very complicated but quite important elements that I think, if you think of addictions, you can understand it as basically a kind of personal disaster, where the impact of actually how profound to have a significant addiction is, I think really is kind of, it's like a personal disaster. Equally, I think, if we look on both sides for the disaster aspects, that one is more likely to be involved in a disaster, even with a 16-car pileup or a house fire if one has an addictions. But equally, for the disaster aspects, if one's in a disaster, you're more likely to probably have a sort of maladaptive coping strategy by developing an addiction. So I think some of the crossover effects of really understanding what kind of impact in a very profound and meaningful way to start to unpick these elements. And I think the recent humanitarian aid trip, I think both my interest in my further studies in disaster medicine, it really did bring home a lot of powerful and important kind of learning points, which I want to share with you today. And I think so the first part of, I'm going through some of the theory and want to link that together. So let me start with that. So I think there's a question about, are we comparing apples to oranges here? And as I said before, I think in a lot of ways we need to understand them as both fruit. That this is something where they may look quite different, but equally the relationship, when you start to look at it at another more contextualized, larger level, it's really important when starting to sort of see how they layer together, especially the emotional impact and implications. Because I think as I'll go through and really highlight these elements, it's how disasters and addictions, how they impact one's neuropsychological system, one's emotional system. It really is profoundly impactful. And I think oftentimes, and really if we think of the treatment of complex addictions and with disasters, there are very powerful affects and emotions that for the person to really, really get well, we need to help them work through it and to reconnect with them so that they're not stuck in this kind of vicious cycle or loop in a way. So for disasters medicine, one way to define it is that it overwhelms the whatever the capacity for one to treat and to be able to deal with this in a timely manner. And I think it covers all aspects from technology, infectious disease, logistics, the impact of everything from pandemics, mass shootings, house fires, earthquakes, floods. I mean, it really does cover a huge amount. And I think part of it also is understanding what level of it affects an entire nation, like with Haiti, or whether, oftentimes with Hull, when it floods, it's a whole community, and it's understanding what kind of effects it has and really sort of disrupting very significant aspects of the connections and support that's there. And I think one of the key elements that I'll unpack a bit more as we go through. It's the support and the connections that are there, as well as the kind of emotional structures that really are significantly impacted. And I think it's important to understand that. Addictions medicine, a lot of the elements of understanding, it covers everything from psychology, psychiatry, internal medicine, social work. It has a large gamut of specialty aspects where the multidisciplinary aspects of how it crosses over and what kind of effects are there, it's really important. And if we think of one of the things that's fascinating about addictions in terms of, from a psychological perspective, in terms of treatment, the complexity, because addictions are the sort of standard drugs, alcohol, cannabis, solvents, but everything, including relationships. If we think of gambling, eating problems, sex, relationship aspects, it covers, I think, even if we think of tattooing and body marking, it really does cover a huge number of things. And I think the elements of really understanding that one can get an addiction to anything. And we can talk more about this as we go through, but it's a relationship that is largely dysfunctional, and that's how affectively it disrupts and kind of breaks down certain structures in quite fundamental ways. But I think both for addictions and for disasters, I think one thing that I'm going to come back to is how it dysregulates the system and really powerfully causes a tremendous disruption in one sense of self, sense of security, sense of well-being. One of the elements, if we think of how this distorts or kind of malforms both the positive elements, if we think of, this is Jaak Panksepp's diagram of the affective neuroscience. And, the seeking system, the play, the affect and care system, the social regulatory system, that a lot of both addictions and disasters will really dampen those down and really undermine them. And I think for the negative ones, if we think of the affect rage system, the panic system, and the fear system. And these are all, I can talk more about these in more detail as we go through. But these will really heighten them, and they will stop a more ordinary process to be able to metabolize experience that is stressful or whatever. And it's more likely, if we think of the right brain really gets hit, the right hemisphere gets hit with more severe stresses, and the left hemisphere is much more sort of mild. And the extraordinary dysregulating process with a disaster or with an addiction, it undermines both the positive and negative aspects, so it really does transform both of them in quite powerful ways. And this part is the limbic system. If we think of, this is kind of the classic higher level cerebellum, or sorry, cerebrum. And this is the more emotional part of the brain. This is the hippocampus, this is the amygdala. The amygdala is sort of classic for mediating fear. And it's important to know that the smaller the amygdala is, the more vulnerable. And some of Doug Bremner's work on looking at the effects of stress in the hippocampus. Stress really does kind of cull or thin out a lot of both areas in the hippocampus and the amygdala. That's the olfactory bulb in terms of sense of smell and the memories created with smell. And something I'm going to come back to, this is the anterior cingulate, and this kind of loop here. A lot of the fear and threat detection aspects is located in this part of the anterior cingulate. And there's another part that's about here that's a little bit further out called the insula that maps into the body. And it does some really spectacular elements. So what I want us to be able to kind of hold in mind that both the addictions and disasters really hyper triggers and really has an extraordinary impact on this emotional part of the brain. and this is out of Panksepp's new book. And if we think of a lot of the neurohormones going up, this is sort of as we go up, that the higher level kind of emotions where we have these sort of basic systems, and if we think of blame, shame, guilt, trust, empathy, that we need to get some of these in place, these sort of secondary aspects, to get these sort of tertiary parts of the brain working, so we can get things like sort of mindfulness or a capacity to mentalize, which are more reflective in complex functions. And the HPA axis, which the hypothalamic pituitary axis, that these are very core regulatory parts of the brain, the body, and the system. And when these start to become dysregulated, they have a profound effect on everything from the sleep-wake cycle to how we're able to kind of mediate hormones, how we can just even sort of regulate ourselves on a basic level. And when all these things get thrown off, we really do start to have a lot of conflict, literally at every level, and from the immunological level all the way to the social level. And what I hope to show is that this even goes up to the social cultural level, you know, in societies and other aspects. This transforms every capacity at literally every level, from the neuropeptide level, which is smaller than sort of atomic, all the way up to sort of national level. And this is from some of my earlier work. That I want us to be able to think of it in absolutely very diagrammatic, simplified ways. And if we think of, in a lot of ways, this is what I would describe a kind of very schematic structure of a healthy system. And if we notice that each of these kind of diamond shapes, they beautifully and neatly fit in each of those things, and they can be structured together and they hold together really quite beautifully. If we have something, the snowflake one kind of it really does kind of represent a sort of diagrammatic way. If we think of something like in addictions, you know, if you think of alcohol or drugs, it stops us thinking, it stops us feeling. Distress also stops us being able to do that in a coherent, integrated way. There's no way that that structure can neatly fit into there, and it will sort of, like a game of Tetris, it sort of agglomerates up, and it actually doesn't link up or make sense. And I want us to come back to that point a bit later. The first two diagrams are Santiago Romani and Cajal's beautiful drawings of a neuron and the spinal ganglion in the motor neurons there. And these two are Leonardo da Vinci's drawings, sort of the muscle system, and what I want to show here is sort of the lymphatic system and the organ system. So the endocrine system, the lymphatic system, all of these link up in quite dynamic and very impactful ways, that when we talk about sort of an alcohol addiction or a drug addiction, or how being frightened to death if we think of a disaster, and there's been work on you know, sudden death syndrome and other things, that a lot of these, we need to understand these are linked in to a very powerful body system. And these are not separate. And the other thing, if we think of cortisol, we think, as I said before, the stress hormone, these are really strong, extremely subtle neurohormones that absolutely have a profound effect on the body. And the oxytocin, if we think of what is, it's kind of described as a sort of love hormone. It's more precisely a sort of neurohormone that has to do with confidence and sort of reinforces complex instinctual behavior. So that what some of the research on PTSD is sort of nasal inhalant oxytocin to be able to have a higher level of trust. And if we think of these as almost opponent process systems, when one is stressed or one is really overwhelmed, the difference between the cortisol system versus the oxytocin, one will just kind of negatively impinge or impact, and the other will just literally switch to a more positive system, and they're like gating mechanisms. Some of the work by McKay et al. literally looking at some of NPY. It's a sort of neural gating system which actually switches on or switches off some of these elements. And the subtlety and the complexity, if we think of how, in our bodies and how these map in to, for example, what Bud Craig describes as sort of the global emotional moment, that we really do get a sense of integrated time, space, emotion that really maps into not only our own bodies, but to others. So all of these systems, in terms of the micro-expressions, all of these things are synced and actually integrated with other people's bodies, minds, and beings on a sort of emotional and social level. So I've wanted to take some of these points and really understand kind of some take-home points that I've been thinking about that I would really enjoy a kind of more open discussion about, hopefully if we have time at the end here. And I think we need to understand all of these aspects as complex systems. And both addictions and disasters, as I've said before, these really disrupt positive systems and coherent emotional experiences. If we think of what I described before about things neatly fitting together, trauma really does disrupt these elements. And Ross and Ross's definition that what we're understanding, I think I at least personally have never heard someone describe either a significant addiction or a disaster as something that's easy to resolve. And I think the complexity that they boil it down to these 7 points, which I think have really helped me think through some of the difficulties and the challenges with working with both of these aspects. One, the instability that whatever one tries to do, if we think of the infrastructure in a disaster or trying to treat particularly not just the individual, but the whole family system of someone with an addiction, it tends to implode. There's unintended consequences. One makes a move to sort of bring in humanitarian aid relief, and all sorts of things happen that one doesn't quite intend to happen. There's a lot of error aspects. There's a lot of almost aspects that repeat and kind of loop. There's a problem of scale, a sense of redundancy that whatever one does, you sort of have to build it in again. And the complexity to having something where you need a tremendous understanding of not just one area, but a whole number of them, and to be able to make sure that you're able to go back and forth easily and with high levels of communication. But all of these boil down to kind of one key point, that this sort of progressive degradation of human values and the quality of life. And I think this is a fundamental element where one of the significant challenges with dealing with these layers and the conversations that I've had the privilege to have both with my friends and colleagues about this, that this is such a layered element that it really does need unpacking over a long period of time to really understand how pervasive these are, internally just as well as externally. That we have to do a lot of unlearning in ourselves to be able to identify these things, to really make as positive a difference as possible. And I think, so the key points of disaster recovery, that in trying to sort of look at some of the best of the literature, these kind of 4 points where assessment, planning, implementation, monitoring, if we think of refugee displacement, that there's a sense of what are the long-term ecological, emotional, financial, economic impacts of all of that, and also being able to evaluate and understand it. And it's very interesting with the problems with disaster recovery work or disaster medicine, all of these things are usually where the key problems lie. And a beautiful example is with the Pakistan earthquake. The follow-up work, when 8 years later they went to go back as a UN process of just sort of checking and to try to make sense of what the learning points were, that there were men, women, and children hobbling around with external fixators 8 years later. Keep in mind these should be only on for a month or so at most, but no orthopedic surgeons went back and actually, after doing the operations, told people that they were supposed to take them off. And 8 years later, they were still walking around. Not just one or two, I think probably hundreds, which is a shocking, shocking thought. For addictions treatment, these are really kind of some of the key points which are really helpful to think about. We need to understand addictions as a mental health disorder. And there's a lot of debate about this, but more and more this is really coming to the fore as a sort of crucial aspect. We need to understand, in terms of the treatment, the centrality of the therapeutic alliance. And we need to treat patients based on a real understanding that there's different aspects. They're not just a sort of addict, they're mothers, fathers, grandparents, people that work in XYZ environments, or people in the community, and it's very easy to sort of boil down and have very sort of negative sense of self. If we think of being able to have built-in kind of, as the Ross and Ross aspect, the kind of redundancy to make sure that there are clear paths forward, to make sure that if there are problems that do occur, and trust me, they really are with addictions treatment. A lot of things happen and one can get triggered off, and it's crucial to make sure that you have things in place to help with that. So understanding healing through the process of identity and understanding, as linking to the sort of multiplicity itself, that one's identity and that change will really happen, and that needs to be understood from both the therapeutic side and the therapeutic community, and from the person's own self. And that some of the aspects that we need to have an idea of a kind of recovery culture, that this is not, you have the addictions and you don't have it. There's a lot of things that go into place that we need to support people, and I'll talk about this a bit later. But in a similar way to the external fixators, Russell Brand had a very interesting documentary about addictions where he made the point that people who have been taken off of heroin for treatment have been put onto methadone and literally left on there to the point where their whole lives, in quite high levels of methadone, and it really has a major negative impact on their whole being. And I think that it's the kind of psychosocial equivalent of a kind of medical oversight about really understanding all of these key points. Bringing it to sort of another sort of point of learning, I guess. In knowing the terrain, there's some really wonderful bits of work that have been organized to collate unbelievably complex and rich depth of information. This is one, the SPHERE project, in terms of the disaster medicine. And this is available online. If you can look it up, if you just look up for the SPHERE project. And it really does, it has some wonderful things in terms of humanitarian charter, core maps of kind of minimum standards and how to, the pragmatics of running a refugee camp for 100,000 people. And I can go into this more a bit later. But there are also some very good guidelines for addictions, and this is the nice one for the alcohol use disorders. And if we think of everything from the internal medicine issues with cirrhosis of the liver, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome for the neurological disorders as a sort of impact of seeing what things can happen from long-term alcohol use, the social vulnerability. This is a very good integrated NHS guideline to begin to start to think about how these work together. However, what I would, for both of these aspects, it's the human factors element, both for the people who are in charge as well as for the people who are receiving these elements, that oftentimes that we miss significant aspects about. And I think it's at least for the alcohol, or for the addiction side, for example, the alcohol, this is such a pervasive part of society. It's very difficult to be able to step outside and to how to mediate these aspects. And I think that's one difference between the disaster aspect and sort of addictions, is that it's just like with having an eating disorder, you can't really get away from eating. And these things really pervade at quite a deep level. And getting into sort of more of the details of going back to what I originally started from, we need to understand what vulnerability and resiliency are. And I think part of what I'm in really trying to think through this, there are some real problematic aspects because most of the definitions of vulnerability or resiliency, and there are some exceptions, are quite kind of dry, academic kind of ways of seeing it. And this doesn't really connect with the lived experience and really understanding both from the personal side of things and in terms of the treatment side, what the hell it really is and how do we get to grips with it so that it's not something that we talk about in the third person, but it's something that's embodied, it's connected, it's understandable. And yeah, so if we can see that this description is a collective measure of human welfare that integrates environmental, social, economic, health, political exposure to harmful aspects. And I think, like I said before, that we need to come up with something that actually is much more meaningful. And again, you know, with either an addictions or disaster issues, you know, it boils down to that there's some people that are more vulnerable. But basically, if anyone actually is on the receiving end of either of those aspects, either as a family system or in terms of firsthand, either from addictions or disaster, and keep in mind the other thing too is intergenerationally, I think it's really important when you start to get to know and you ask people about their experience, not just in terms of firsthand, but that can be there too, but intergenerationally and even culturally, how much one has been exposed to war, plague, disasters. I was saying to one of my friends a little while ago that there's a plague pit down by sort of where I live, and you know these are really kind of layered, complex elements that oftentimes we can miss. And I think the other thing too is that there's a co-occurrence of issues with either PTSD or substance disorder that, as I said before, one does link with the other, and it's easy to miss these things. And you know, if someone has an addiction, that being able to really contextualize it and understand they actually may be trying to cope with something for particular reasons that are way beyond what they can emotionally take, you know, process. And I think that's it brings it where it's less shameful, it's less distressing, and one can be able to talk about mental health issues or, you know, the integration of these issues without it being so stigmatizing or problematic. And this is not my photograph, but this is when the Haitian earthquake first happened. And amongst all this, if we think about, it's interesting to think about why that building, as opposed to all the others, you know, stayed erect rather than falling down. And I guess these are some of the things with the health strengthening aspects. You know, how do we begin to really understand the difference between strengthening individuals and systems and all the aspects so that you know, one is not as vulnerable, and that these positive frameworks, they are really protective. However, you can see that the devastation, damage, this is again the Haitian earthquake, this is not my photograph, but one I was able to access. You know, this is probably, I think, a 6-story building that's the size of a pancake now. And what happens when, you know, why did something which, if we compare the Japanese earthquake with the Haitian earthquake, the Japanese earthquake was several thousand times bigger in terms of the Richter scale impact of it, but there was nowhere near the damage as in with Haiti. And if we think about sort of kind of on the emotional level, if we think of some of these key kind of points of vulnerability, so insecure attachment, this is Goldberg's work, ineffective parenting, kind of unique, unusual kind of child issues, and high family adversity, or what Brown describes as high EE, high expressed emotional styles of communication. that these really do kind of contribute to deficits in empathy, deficits in kind of emotional processing at very significant levels. This is Simon Baron-Cohen's work in looking at deficits in empathy, where if you collate all of these, he describes something, you get a zero negative style of empathy. But each of these you can track back to actual, not just genetic, but in terms of parental styles or kind of distress levels. So, human beings and family systems have the same issues with lack of support and other things where it really does make an impact. And the resiliency, I think there's actually more kind of creative work happening with the definitions and understanding what resiliency is. And there's a wonderful, I think it's about 185 pages, it's available on the web, the Rand positional paper on resilience. It really goes into some spectacular detail and thought about, what is resiliency, how does it work? And looking at everything from the individual factors, family factors, positive coping, thinking, affect, sense of realism, sense of being able to have a sort of healthy level of inhibition, family factor, the sense of communication, love, support, nurturing, adaptability, the opposite of what we were looking at 2 slides ago or 3 slides ago. And then, for teams and units, sort of looking, for example, at the military, being able to work together, having extraordinarily supportive teamwork and cohesion, and community level factors where all of these kind of like a sort of nest of Russian dolls, they sit inside each other and they do communicate and have a sort of life of their own. And I think, the difference between the ability to cope with stress effectively in a healthy manner, the ability to seek help and also have something that's responsive and compassionate and helpful. A sense of meaning well beyond kind of oneself, where there's a real depth of connection, and the difference between letting go of some of the negative factors of seeing things or seeing oneself as a victim or one's environment versus being able to kind of have a much more proactive, positive one. And I think being able to help others, of getting beyond one's kind of own, if you look at Baron-Cohen's work, we need to be able to connect to others. It was very interesting in my research before I went to Haiti. One of the things that startled me and I thought was kind of amazing, there was thought to be about 300,000 people that have died in Haiti. And some of the structural work, about 200,000 of those looks like they could have been saved with just having bracket support in the corner of the rooms. If you think of, kind of just 15p little brackets could have prevented the collapse of the buildings that, like I've showed you before. And I think this kind of visual, literal metaphor of the health strengthening, of just putting something together and putting it so that these things actually link up and are supported, they really make a difference. And we can think of this emotionally in a very, very similar way, that if we think of strengthening systems and understanding, identifying where there's vulnerabilities, and being able to strengthen those, they really transform lives. This is Doc Forgy, who headed the program in Haiti, and this is one of you working in the school that day. The support, and I think when I've spoken with my colleagues and other things, it was a notable difference, the care that we had for each other and the climate, and also what we were able to help other people with. And it really developed a kind of sense of leadership and development that really was quite felt and special. If we, almost like a mathematical equation, so I hate to think of it like that, if we understand that psychological risk is a kind of balance between vulnerability and resiliency, where if there's stronger one to other, it does change the sense of perceived risk, the sense of control and predictability, physical, emotional injury, all of these aspects, and even the kind of coping that does evolve. And I've really been looking into this question at a very, very deep level, and the thing that I was stunned by, most of these things boil down to that if there is trauma, it fragments a sense of coherent integration, and it actually sort of it profoundly undermines systems where there's no spectrums of elements, that things are not linked together in a way which feels understandable and coherent. And it's amazing how pervasive these aspects are. On this side, if we think of it almost sort of going up from issues of vulnerability to sort of high performance aspects of resiliency, and on the y-axis here, this is different types of interventions that increasingly go from quite heavy-duty ones to much more sort of positive and supportive elements and sort of creative. But it's very important that each individual and also each system needs to link together to see where they are in this spectrum of things. And it's sort of an X, Y, Z axis of making sense of where, in a more dynamic way, of the relationship between these elements. This is a really sort of tidy diagram about what ideally should happen, going along this ways over time for a disaster, and being able to manage that, where there's different phases of things. And getting back to what I was saying before, that these developmental aspects, it's really important to be able to understand that different phases need very different things. And like the recovery culture, you can't do one before you do the other. You need to sort of follow in a kind of logical step. Because if you think of, you need to get the food in and make sure that disease issues are not running endemic in the refugee camp or in terms of Haiti before you can do some of the psychosocial stuff. And this is sort of the motivational interview that's sort of classic for addictions medicine, which I always thought was interesting, that this is quite a linear, straightforward element, and this tends to sort of loop around, which if you think of, I think it does say something about how sort of some of the addictionologists have understood where, unfortunately, there's more focus on relapse rather than sort of progressive development. So we can talk more about that later. But I think we need to think about a strengthening and where, having a very clear assessment in what things need to be there to be able to make sure that we're understanding what the needs of the system are and how to really work through it in the best way possible. This was a newspaper article that highlighted that a Nepalese aid worker brought in a case of cholera that was, this was a disease that was not known in Haiti to pretty much any degree. And 17 months after this person brought it in, keep in mind this was a UN aid worker, there was 7,050 deaths and 531,000 people were affected. 5% of the population was affected by cholera. And if you can see this sweat patch here, I realized sort of the Achilles with his vulnerable ankle, I had a small cut in my toe when I was fording a river. That I really I got a very short and sharp first-hand experience of cholera, and I think the difference, though, it sort of brings back to the 8th point here, that vulnerable systems, that vulnerability begets vulnerability, and also resiliency supports resiliency. And one of the key things that's very difficult, especially with something that is in a super vulnerable environment, and I think Haiti especially, it's had over 1,000 years as a slave culture. With Hispaniola, the smallpox, I mean, it's had an endemic spread of really profound disease impact. When I was reading to my older son, Orpheus and Eurydice, he said, did you go there? And I said, do you mean hell? And he said, no, Hades. And I said, no. But it got me to think that there are elements where every aspect of the culture, the vulnerability, it super saturates at pretty much every level. It's even those who are super resilient, and luckily I had the vaccine for the cholera, which it made all the world of difference. For the people who didn't have that, one of my sort of American friends and AIDS workers did not have it, and the difference was noticeable. I think the other thing is about being able to help others to be able to help themselves, and I think I can talk more about this a bit later, but the difference between getting people out of a very stuck cycle where they saw themselves in a very kind of anchored way, and really changing the way that they felt about their experience and about themselves. There's some very important elements of that changed my view of it. That the family medicine aspect, because the trauma that really, and I trained as an EMT, as sort of a paramedic before, so I was going there mostly what I thought was to use my expertise in more medical aspects. But the difference between a lot of my friends and colleagues there were saying, can you come over and actually help someone that had to identify one of their family members who had died, or someone who had never been able to find their son. And it was really interesting understanding what kind of impact at all sorts of levels, distress and the physical hardship, but that was not the difficult thing. The difficult thing was the emotional ties that felt broken down or lost to a degree. And I found that quite moving. This was about a few minutes before I was going on air for Haitian radio, and working with one of the translators to talk to the Haitian public about how do we increase their sense of kind of proactive self-care and well-being. And it was a really interesting experience to think about talking to 700,000 Haitians and the difference between talking with one person one-to-one versus a sort of whole community of people. This was some of the group that we went with, and we really supported each other. This was one of the markets, and I think in a lot of ways, I had been to third world countries before, but it was interesting. There were aspects, that there were parts of the country that were so desolate, and really you could see the suffering, and there were other parts that were just spectacular. And it was interesting to see the contrast. This is one of the banana markets. And these sort of micro-environments, the person that we stayed with was one of the professor of agriculture, and he worked to rebuild kind of sustainable ecosystem where he really did, it was extraordinary what he was able to do. But there was these sort of small environments where the infrastructure and really changing the way that we were thinking about a lot of these elements of really regrowing something very special and important. And I think a lot of my experiences really changed the way I thought about both integrated and sustainable care, and what kinds of things we need to do in terms of leadership responsibility, not just in terms of other environments, but also our own. I'm now working with someone who's trying to sort of help for the geriatric population to work with older people, and I think there's some really wonderful things that creatively when we start to get unstuck and motivated, and to be able to help other people, that really heals things at a very important level, and where we can work together collaboratively and with great compassion. And I think it sort of brings back to a really important point, that a lot of what is in conflict, that can be healed, but we're shifting between systems of almost cruelty to systems of compassion, internally and externally. And I think it changes very deep ways that we think about how we solve problems. And I think I want to go to one thing. This is a principal component analysis of some of the research I've been doing. And one of the things that's absolutely amazing about it is how important negative learning is. That boiled down a lot of very complex elements to three key systems. One, negativity, which is sort of that one, the positive aspects and intellectual sort of outcome with it. And I think it's essential for us to understand that negative learning experiences are the strongest type of learning that we can have. Aversive learning, out of 909 or 1,000 experiences, you can have 999 which are positive. One can be negative, and that can change the game in terms of how one experiences a lot of things. And it takes priority over the positive aspects, but it profoundly impacts every aspect of one's intellectual, emotional, social, emotional, and even kinesthetic aspects. And I think, how do we, I think one of the things that we can talk about, I think, together, to my mind, how we navigate and deal with the impact of negative or distressing experiences is one of the most complex issues I think we face as sort of a human species, or even as a world in a way. And how do we shift that to be able to deal with it really deeply, helpfully, and to find a good solution for it. And so we can have experiences where we really can connect and get the best out of ourselves, rather than be entrenched in things that are destructive. And a lot of, if I take home some of the things that I've developed from some of my work, is the idea of systemic healing, that we have to think in systems. We have to be able to think about not just propping things up or just letting them be there where they're not actually integrated and healed. And I think some of the ways to do that is make sure that we have something that's integrated, that's compassion-based, that's done in stages or developmental aspects, and that's actually sustainable. And I think these elements, to my mind, I think would be one of the most important innovations that we can work both individually and as a sort of larger aspect. And it's very important to be able to understand how important each individual is, but also each individual of how that one person can change an organization, and they can help actually facilitate change and lead change in very critical ways. And I think those are some of the things that we really need to get better with. And I developed my company based on some of these ideas and principles. I'm talking about that later. But I think the overall aim of what I want to make sure that we kind of link together is this integrated view of illness and health. And I think it's absolutely essential that we understand this as part of a spectrum and not split down the middle where they're separate. We need to be able to resolve problems and challenges with an integrated model of clinical and effective neuropsychology. That we need to understand how emotions really are at a very key level of both as human beings and other, if we think of the addictions and disasters, that things really impact us, but they impact our emotions and our capacity to relate. And we need to link up sort of an understanding that throughout our lifetime and other people's, we need to make sense of what the difference between how that affects someone, if we think of an addictions when they're 3 or 4 versus 30 or 40 or 90 or 100. We need to also have a coherent theoretical model of really how vulnerability and resiliency interact. And I think this is something that is, to my mind, we're still only in the beginning stages of. In conclusion, the things that I want everyone to kind of hopefully learn from this is that vulnerability and resiliency changes the directions of the process of well-being. And I think it's essential that we understand how this works and how we can start to really support positive changes and understand and protect where those vulnerabilities are. And we need to do that proactively. So I think if I was an engineering person going through Haiti before the earthquake happened, and the difference between those are 200,000 lives that we could have saved. And the difference between being able to start to think about that in a responsible pro-social manner is important. Disasters and addictions, because I think in a lot of ways we need to see the sort of chiasmic structures and the interaction between both of these things. They malform emotional and social structures at a very deep level, and these go on for generations, and I can talk more about that later if you wish. We need to identify and strengthen areas of difficulty to be able to reduce the vulnerability, as I said before, and we need to make sure that we can help the development of individuals and social systems to reduce the negativity and increase all aspects of well-being. And the goal is to really improve our lives, because I think one of the things, if we reduce that negativity, we can get the positive aspects up. And our flexibility, our intelligence at every different aspect, every different level of what it means to be a human being can completely transform. I think what we're capable of understanding in terms of as individuals and the human race, I think is nowhere near where it should be. In terms of my looking at a kind of overview of sampling of different populations, the average person is nowhere near as healthy as I think we should be. And I think we need to make sure that we do that to be able to incrementally help each person and as a system to really evolve and develop at deep levels. Thank you very much for your patience, and I welcome any questions.